The doctor hesitated before speaking, the way people do when they know the next sentence will shatter a life. I watched her eyes move from the chart to my face, then to my daughter, lying quietly on the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling like she always did when she was overwhelmed. When the word pregnant finally left the doctor's mouth, my mind rejected it completely. My daughter couldn't even explain a headache properly. She couldn't tell time. She barely understood the world beyond our home. I laughed at first because surely it was a mistake. But the ultrasound screen didn't lie. As I stood there, numb and shaking, one terrifying question clawed its way into my chest. Who had access to her when I was in tea looking? I went home that night pretending everything was normal, pretending my hands weren't trembling as I cooked dinner, pretending I didn't feel danger breathing inside my own house. Everyone was asleep when I opened my husband's laptop. I told myself I was just looking for answers, not suspects. But within seconds, I realized this wasn't a search for truth anymore. It was a descent into something I could never unsee. And in that moment, I understood the most horrifying lesson of my life. Sometimes the person you trust to protect your child is the one you should fear the most. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from a test result or a doctor's call. It came from routine things quietly falling apart. My daughter Sarah had always lived inside a narrow, carefully managed world. At 22, her mind still hovered somewhere around early childhood. She needed help choosing clothes, forgot meals unless reminded, and clung to familiar routines like lifelines. Any change, even a different brand of cereal, could unravel her entire day. So when she started waking up nauseous every morning, I assumed anxiety. When she refused food she usually loved, I blamed a stomach bug. When her clothes began fitting differently, I told myself it was weight gain from inactivity. Mothers like me learn early to explain away small irregularities because life is already heavy enough. It was the fall in the bathroom that finally forced me to stop pretending. She slipped while brushing her teeth, her knees buckling without warning. As I helped her up, I noticed how pale she was, how her breathing felt shallow against my shoulder. There was fear in her eyes, not the loud kind, just a quiet confusion, as if her body was betraying her and she didn't know how to say it. The clinic smelled like antiseptic in old magazines. Sarah sat beside me, swinging her feet, humming under her breath. The nurse asked questions directly to her, then quickly redirected them to me. We had lived this dance for decades. Blood pressure. Wait, routine tests. Nothing unusual until the doctor came back with a crease between her eyebrows that had been there before. She asked me to step outside for a moment. That moment stretched into something elastic and unreal. I remember the doctor's voice sounding too calm, too measured. I remember staring at her mouth, watching the words form before I could absorb them. Positive. Confirmed. Weeks along, no mistake. I laughed, a sharp, inappropriate sound that startled even me. I told her she had the wrong file, the wrong patient. I listed my daughter's limitations like credentials, as if logic could erase biology. The doctor didn't interrupt. She just waited, the way people do when they've delivered bad news before. When she brought me back into the room and showed me the ultrasound, something inside my chest collapsed. Sarah looked at the screen with mild curiosity, then turned to me and asked if we could go home. She didn't understand what was happening inside her body. She didn't understand why my hands were shaking. On the drive home, the world outside the windshield felt distant and unreal. I kept glancing at my daughter in the passenger seat, replaying every memory. Every day I'd left her at home while I ran errands. Every time I trusted that she was safe because she was surrounded by family. My husband had always been good with her patient. Helpful. Dependable. He insisted on taking care of her when I worked late. Called it giving me a break. That thought made my stomach turn. And that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, long after everyone had gone to bed. The house creaked softly. Familiar sounds that used to bring comfort now felt like warnings. I opened a notebook and started writing down dates, schedules, moments that once felt insignificant. I wasn't looking for proof yet. I wasn't ready for that. I was just trying to understand how something impossible had happened right under my roof. When Sarah wandered into the kitchen half asleep and leaned against my arm, I wrapped her in my arms and held her longer than usual. She rested her head on my shoulder, trusting, unaware, safe in a way that suddenly felt fragile. As she went back to bed, I watched her disappear down the hallway and felt a promise, harden inside me. Whatever this was, however ugly or unthinkable, the truth might be, I would find it, because a diagnosis had changed everything. I could no longer afford to look away. Guilt doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves, slipping into ordinary moments and poisoning them. The next morning, as I watched Sarah struggle to button her sweater, memories began replaying themselves with cruel clarity. Times I'd rushed out the door. Evenings, I'd been too tired to notice the small changes in her mood. Days, I trusted that the walls of our home were enough to protect her. I remembered how she'd started flinching when someone touched her unexpectedly. How she'd grown unusually quiet whenever my husband entered the room. At the time, I told myself she was going through a phase, that her anxiety was worsening, that I was overthinking things the way exhausted mothers sometimes do. Now those excuses tasted bitter. The signs were everywhere once I allowed myself to see them. The locked bedroom door I'd found once and dismissed as a mistake. The way he insisted on handling her baths, saying it helped her feel calm. The late nights when he volunteered to stay home with her so I could rest. Each memory lined up like dominoes, and I felt sick realizing how icily they fell. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, a new detail surfaced: her sudden fear of the laptop room. Her confusion when I asked innocent questions, the way she clung to me more tightly than before. My mind kept circling the same question, over and over. How did I miss this? By midweek, the guilt had become physical. My chest ached. My hands trembled. I went through the motions of daily life while carrying a constant, crushing weight. When my husband spoke, his voice sounded different to me now, too smooth, too careful. I watched him more closely than I ever had, studying his expressions, the way his eyes moved when Sarah entered the room. He noticed. "Are you okay?" he asked one evening, his tone almost concerned. I nodded too quickly. Lying had become second nature in our house, and that realization frightened me even more. I started retracing our routines, checking dates against Sarah's medical timeline, counting backward from the doctor's estimate. Each calculation narrowed the window. Each narrowed window tightened the knot in my stomach. There were only a handful of days it could have happened, days when I wasn't home, days when I trusted him completely. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I found one of Sarah's old drawings tucked into a pillowcase. Stick figures. A house. A large figure standing too close to a smaller one. At the time she'd drawn it, I'd praised her creativity and taped it to the fridge. Now I stared at it with tears blurring my vision, wondering if she had tried to tell me in the only way she knew how. I wanted to ask her desperately, but I didn't know how without confusing or frightening her. Every professional I spoke to warned me. Be careful, go slowly, don't lead her, don't make promises you can't keep. It felt unbearable to move so cautiously when my heart was screaming for answers. Late one night, I stood outside her bedroom door, listening to her breathe. The house was quiet, my husband already asleep. I pressed my palm against the door frame and let the guilt wash over me fully. I wasn't just angry at him anymore. I was angry at myself for trusting to isolate, for assuming safety instead of ensuring it. I understood then that guilt wasn't something I could escape. It was something I would have to carry, at least for a while. But beneath it, something else was forming, something steadier, harder. Resolve. If I had failed to protect my daughter once, I would not fail her again. And whatever truth was hiding in this house, I was getting closer to a Tevin if it destroyed everything I thought I knew. I didn't plan to look at his laptop that night. I told myself I needed sleep, that exhaustion was making me paranoid, that grief and guilt were twisting my thoughts into something ugly. But fear has a way of sharpening instincts, and mine wouldn't let me rest. Every sound in the house felt louder than usual, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the slow rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. I waited until I was sure he was asleep. The laptop was in the study, exactly where he always left it. He was careless with it, confident in the illusion that there was nothing to hide. I sat at the desk, my heart pounding so loudly, I was afraid it might wake him. For a moment I just stared at the screen, my reflection faintly visible in the dark glass holder, thinner, terrified. I told myself. I was only looking for clues, emails, schedules, anything that could explain how this had happened without pointing where I feared it might. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally lifted the lid. It opened without a password. That alone sent a chill through me. He'd always been meticulous about security at work, obsessive even. But here in the place where he felt most powerful, he hadn't bothered. The desktop loaded slowly. I started with the obvious email, browsing history, nothing immediately incriminating. Just work correspondence, news articles, the harmless digital clutter of an ordinary life. My chest loosened slightly, and for one fragile second, I thought maybe I had been wrong. Then I noticed a folder on the corner of the screen. It wasn't hidden, just oddly named something generic, forgettable, the kind of label designed not to draw attention. I clicked it. Inside were more folders, dates, initials. My breath caught as I recognized one of them, Sarah's. My hands began to shake so violently I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. I clicked. What I found wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. Audio recordings, notes, short videos that made my vision blur before I could fully process them. In one clip, I heard his voice, soft, coaxing, falsely gentle. In another, I saw my daughter's familiar room from an angle that made my stomach turn. Her voice was confused, uncertain, asking questions that broke something deep inside me. I covered my mouth to keep from screaming. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern, planned, documented. Hidden in plain sight while I cooked dinners, paid bills, and trusted the man sleeping down the hall to protect our family, I don't remember how long I sat there. Time stopped meaning anything. I just remember the moment clarity finally cut through the shock. The pregnancy wasn't the first violation. It was the result of many. I closed the laptop slowly, my movements careful, mechanical. Panic would come later. Rage would come later. Right then, all I felt was a cold, precise determination settle into my bones. I copied everything onto a flash drive, my fingers moving with surprising steadiness. I erased nothing. I left everything exactly as it was. When I returned to the bedroom, my husband shifted slightly in his sleep. I stared at his face in the dim light, searching for the man I thought I knew. He looked peaceful, ordinary, harmless. I lay down beside him without touching him, the space between us suddenly vast and unbridgeable. My heart was racing, but my mind was clear for the first time in days. The truth was no longer a question. It was a fact, and now that I had it, everything would change. I closed my eyes and made a silent vow to my daughter, to myself, to the woman I used to be. This house had hidden a nightmare long enough. It was time to bring it into the light. Morning came too quickly, as if the night hadn't been allowed to finish its work. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, soft and ordinary, mocking the war raging inside me. I lay still, listening to my husband move around the house, make coffee, hum to himself like nothing had changed. Like he wasn't standing on the edge of a life about to collapse. Fear whispered first. It told me to stay quiet, to think carefully, to protect what little stability my daughter understood. It reminded me how fragile she was, how easily she became frightened by strangers, uniforms, unfamiliar rooms. It warned me about courtrooms, investigations, questions she might not understand how to answer. Fear was practical, convincing, cruel. Justice spoke more quietly, but it didn't let go. Every time I looked at Sarah, fear weakened. She sat at the kitchen table coloring, her tongue peeking out slightly in concentration, unaware that the world had already failed her once.
Oh.
When she smiled at me, trusting and open, something inside my chest burned. I realized then that silence would be another betrayal, one I would never forgive myself for. I spent the day pretending to listen when my husband talked about work, pretending to care when he asked what was for dinner. Every word he spoke felt contaminated. Every shared memory rewrote itself into something darker. The man I had built a life with no longer existed. In his place was a stranger wearing a familiar face. In the afternoon while he was out, I made the calls. First to Sarah's doctor, my voice shaking as I asked for guidance. Then to a specialist who worked with vulnerable adults. They spoke gently, carefully, as if handling glass. They told me what I already knew but needed to hear. This was something I could handle alone. This wasn't something to hide. By the time I called the police, my hands were steady, saying the words out loud what I had found, What I suspected felt like stepping off a cliff. There was no going back. The officer listened without interrupting, his tone serious, respectful. He told me what would happen next, what steps they would take to protect my daughter first. That word protect cut through everything. When my husband came home that evening, the house felt different, smaller, tighter. He sensed it immediately, asked if something was wrong. I looked at him across the room, this man who had slept beside me, eaten at my table, touched my child, and I felt nothing but resolve. I told him to leave. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. I simply repeated it until confusion turned to irritation, then to anger. He tried to regain control with raised voices and sharp words, but the power he thought he had was already gone. When he finally slammed the door behind him, the silence that followed felt heavy but clean. That night, I slept beside my daughter. She curled into me like she always had, her breathing slow and even. I watched her chest rise and fall and thought about the future, certain, painful, complicated. But it was a future where she would never be alone in this again. Fear didn't disappear. It probably never would. But it no longer had the final say, like justice did. And for the first time since that doctor spoke the word pregnant, I allowed myself to believe that something good, something like healing, might one day grow out of the ruins. Some stories don't end neatly. They don't wrap themselves in comfort or easy answers. What happened to my daughter changed our lives forever, and there are days when the weight of it still takes my breath away. But there is also something powerful that came out of the pain. Truth, spoken out loud, has a way of breaking chains. If this story stayed with you, if it made you uncomfortable, angry, or reflective, then it served its purpose. Because silence is what allows harm to survive. Awareness is where protection begins. If you believe every child and every vulnerable soul deserves safety, dignity, and justice, I invite you to stay with this channel. Subscribe, share this story, and help these voices reach beyond the screen. Someone watching right now may need the courage you just witnessed. Thank you for listening. Q for caring. Q. And most of all, thank you for choosing not to look away.